I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 Facebook group. And I am here tonight with Kelly Frindell of In-House Test Prep. And let me just, Kelly, I'm going to spotlight you so that people can see. And I'm going to, okay, great. So tonight we're going to talk about overcoming SAT and ACT testing anxiety. And if there are other questions related to testing, which I'm sure there might be with a lot of the different changes that we're hearing in the news about schools going back to testing, feel free to ask those questions. Tonight, this is actually officially a meeting as opposed to a webinar. So if you have questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. And I may interrupt Kelly a little bit while she's doing her talk, or we may save them to the end. We'll just see what some of the questions are. But for everybody who's here, if you could maybe put into chat what year your student is in high school, if they've taken any tests or not. And just out of curiosity, if anybody has taken the recent digital SAT test that just happened is in March, right, Kelly?
In March. Yes.
Great. So just, oh, somebody has a junior just took the ACT.
I think scores came back today if they took it on the national test date.
Okay. A junior scheduled to take June ACT and SAT. She is paralyzed with fear. Well, then tonight will be a good conversation. Great. Okay. Okay. Good combination. Some people, children took the digital SAT. They found it harder than the paper.
That's feedback I heard from a lot of students as well.
Okay, yeah. So good people, a lot of experience with students already taking the test. So I'm sure what you have to say tonight, Kelly, will just help improve their students' next round of studying and taking the next version of the test. Okay, do you want to start and maybe give even a little bit more background on yourself? I just gave very, very top line. So
Yeah, sure. So I'm Kelly Frindell, and I own a business called In-House Test Prep, and I've been teaching test prep since about 2001, and I specialize in SAT and ACT, and then I also help younger students with entrance exams to private schools and boarding schools. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this tonight, the test anxiety, is because this is something I'm hearing from my students a lot lately, especially in these last couple of years with the pandemic. Everybody is way more stressed out than usual about these tests. I have a lot of kids coming to me and say, I have test anxiety. I'm a bad test taker. I can't do this. And it's really, I've seen a significant change with that over the last couple of years. And so since I'm having to address it with my students, I know that other students are struggling with it. And so I wanted to put some information out there about what test anxiety is, what it isn't, and really how to deal with it and some strategies, because there's some easy things to do about it. There are some things that take a little bit more work, but there are ways to manage and address it. And I have some slides for you. I'll talk for a little bit. And then if you do have questions towards the end, you can put them in the chat, and Debbie will help me see those, and I'm happy to answer those. And towards the end, if you do have any questions about some of the changes that have been taking place, I'm happy to answer those too if we have time to do it. So let me pull up my slides real quick. And let's see. And Zoom just changed all their format and all their layout, so I'm hoping it is working correctly. It's giving me a little anxiety after they do it a certain way all the time. And Debbie, can you see them okay?
Yes, we can perfectly see your slides. Yes.
Great. Okay. So when we're talking about test anxiety, the first thing that I want to say right off the bat is it's important to know what we're talking about. And there are really kind of two ideas of test anxiety. And I want to give the caveat, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a therapist, I'm also not your therapist or your clinician, so I am not giving you medical advice. That's really important for me to say. And there is a very clinical version of test anxiety that is a specific form of anxiety. It is a disorder, and that kind of anxiety often needs some kind of professional intervention. There's also a more colloquial form of test anxiety that we talk about, and that's really the one I'm going to talk about tonight. And that's the kind I hear all the time from my students coming to me and saying, I'm so anxious about this test. I'm nervous. I can't sleep. I can eat. I'm really stressed about it. And that type of test anxiety, it sounds like it's anxiety, test anxiety, but really what it is it's anxiety about a test that's important. And why it's important to know that is because for most people, it isn't a pathology. And sometimes people will start to get into the mindset of, oh, I have test anxiety. This is the thing that I have. I cannot perform well on tests because of it. And again, there is a clinical diagnosis, and that's its own thing. It deserves its own treatment. But really, what we're talking about now tonight is just being anxious about these tests. And what I want to say about that is that's actually a very normal thing. It is a highly stress provoking situation. And of course, you're going to be anxious about taking it. And what I want you to know is that is normal. And to some degree, it's healthy. It can become unhealthy, certainly. And we'll talk about that. But being anxious about these tests in and of itself is not a bad thing necessarily. And so this more informal form of test anxiety that we're talking about, it is a type of performance anxiety, and it involves a lot of different things. It can involve physiological symptoms, so symptoms of overarousal, like your heart is beating too fast or you're breathing too quickly. You might experience muscle tension. You might feel your shoulders up really high around your neck, and also other kinds of somatic symptoms, like you might feel sick to your stomach. I know for me, when I'm nervous, my hands shake a little bit. It's a little hard to breathe. And these symptoms tend to occur when there's a high pressure testing situation, like a standardized test, like the SAT or ACT. And it also involves feelings of worry and self doubt that can really interrupt your ability to perform well on a test. And if you're not sure what type you have, if you might have a more clinical form or you might just have more of this informal kind, one of the ways to think about that is how much it's affecting you. And so if you really find that you can't eat and you can't sleep and you're worried constantly and you're crying because you're upset about a test and you can't focus, that may indicate that you might want to seek out some type of assistance with that, maybe from a therapist or a psychologist. But if it's just something, and the other thing about that too is if it's showing up in all aspects of test taking, if it's showing up when you take your driver's test, when you have a pop quiz in math, when you take the SAT, when any type of situation like that, if it's really generalized like that, might be a bigger deal. If it's just sort of this, okay, I'm nervous about the SAT, this is probably what we're talking about. And whenever you're talking about anxiety, really any type of anxiety, there's three components to it. There's an emotional component, a cognitive component, and a physical component. The emotional component is feelings. So you might feel stressed out, you might be afraid, you might feel helpless, like I can't do this, or even feelings of disappointment of I'm not going to do well, or I might disappoint my parent or my teachers, or I'm going to disappoint myself. And then the thoughts, the cognitive pieces might be negative thoughts like, I can't do it. I won't be able to do it. You might be worried about past performances. If you know that maybe when you took the PSAT last year, you didn't do as well as you thought, or maybe you got very anxious during that one. So you think, oh, well, I got anxious during that one, so I'm definitely going to get anxious during this one and not do well. And sometimes you might be worried about future consequences of failure too. And this is actually one I hear a lot from my students sometimes. They tend to catastrophize a little bit. They tell me, they say, oh, I'm not going to do well on this test. And if I don't do well on this test, I'm not going to get into college. And if I don't get into college, then I'm not going to get a job. And then I'm going to end up homeless on the street. And then I'm going to die alone. And that there's a whole train of thought that goes along with that. And it sounds kind of ridiculous when you say it out loud, but it is actually a pretty common thought that I run across with my students. And sometimes people really have difficulty distinguishing between emotions and thoughts. And it seems like they should be pretty clear which one's which, but some of that confusion results in the way that we use feel when you say, I feel something. And it feels like anytime you say, I feel something, whatever follows it must be a feeling, except it's really not true. And the way that you can tell the difference is for an emotion, you should be able to sum it up basically in one word. I feel blank. So if someone upsets you about something, let's say if you're an adult and your partner has not taken out the trash again, you, as a feeling, you might say, I feel upset, I feel hurt, I feel disrespected. those are emotions. But if you find yourself adding on a whole long string after that, say, I feel that you never do what you say you're going to do, and I'm stuck doing everything, it's a blah, 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 blah. That is a thought, and that is not a feeling anymore. And we sometimes confuse those. And the reason that it's important to know the difference between those is because the way that you address thoughts and feelings that may not be as helpful or healthy, those ways are different. And we'll talk about some of those ways a little bit later. And then people also might experience physical symptoms of anxiety. Sometimes people will get dizzy because they're hyperventilating. Hyperventilating is when you breathe a little bit too quickly, like this. You might get a headache, maybe an upset stomach, or just kind of that feeling of being on edge. And these are not specific to test anxiety by any means. Probably all of us have experienced some of these things at various times or another. And they're pretty widely recognized symptoms of anxiety. There's several different reasons why people might have anxiety. One of them is just having a previous negative experience with testing. And that could be that somebody took a test in the past and got a much lower score than they were expecting, or maybe something negative actually happened during the testing experience. I've actually had a number of students who have gotten sick during the test, or they've thrown up, or someone near them has thrown up. Or for me, I know when I took the SAT, I was in a big gym and they were doing construction outside and they jackhammered the entire test time. And that was almost 30 years ago, and I still hold a grudge against it because it was so terrible. But having those previous experiences sometimes builds the expectation that the next experience is going to be negative as well. And then this one is really important too, about having overly high expectations. And it is important to have high expectations for yourself. That certainly can be healthy, but it is important to know as well where your actual abilities might be and what is likely to be possible. And sometimes these overly high expectations might come from yourself. You may think, well, my brother or my sister was able to get a 35. They just on the ACT out of 36. They just walked in and sat down and took the test, and I should be able to do that too. And that's something I actually hear all the time from my students as well. And sometimes those expectations are coming from parents too, especially if you're a very highly driven and motivated person. If you went to a very high performing school, you may have expectations of your child that may or may not be realistic. And it is important to really reflect on that and make sure you're not putting undue pressure on your kids as well. You can also have genetic predispositions to anxiety. We don't really know all of the causes yet, but there does seem to be some evidence that the anxiety can be passed down along through genes, but also some of it is environmental too. When you have a parent who's very anxious and their child sees that how they model dealing with anxiety, sometimes they'll pick up those ways as well. And then these last two are really important for me to mention too, because this is something I'm seeing a lot with students that I didn't used to see really prior to the pandemic. Being unprepared is actually a really, really major cause of this anxiety about tests. And I didn't used to see it a lot pre-pandemic, but what I'm seeing now is that students are really coming in without the skills that they used to have and that they need to do well on these tests. So I have a lot of kids, often from very high performing schools, who cannot do basic algebra skills. They can't identify nouns and verbs. They don't know how to use commas. And that is a change. And so being unprepared for a test, of course, is going to cause a significant amount of anxiety, because if you sit down to a packet full of information that you don't know, of course you're going to be stressed and feel unprepared for that. And then the other important issue to pay attention to too is occasionally there may be an undiagnosed learning or attention issue going on in the background. And I do have some students sometimes who come to me and we start working together, and their performance isn't really matching up with what I know about them as a student or what I can tell kind of about their general ability level. And when that happens, and again, I'm not a clinician, so I'm always very careful about it, but a lot of times I'll ask the students very gently if they've ever suspected that something might be going on. And what I often hear is that they'll say, well, I've always kind of wondered if I was dyslexic, or I had a teacher mention that they thought I might have ADHD or something like that. And what tends to happen sometimes is some students who do have a learning difference going on in the background, sometimes they've been able to get through school and use their strategies to work around it and still be very successful in school. They've gotten good grades, they've studied, they've done their homework, and they've been able to manage. But when they hit these tests, sometimes these tests are the first time that people run into something that they cannot maneuver their way around. And so sometimes it is really the first signal of, hey, something is going on here that you need to pay attention to. And we'll talk a little bit more about that
So
later.
Kelly, there was a great question that
Mhm.
somebody asked about if your student, has this type of anxiety,
Mhm.
are there good phrases or statements to say to them to help calm them down?
Yes, we'll get there.
Okay.
We'll get to those a little bit later. Thank you. That is a great question. And here's another important thing to know about anxiety is often anxiety has a bad reputation. And when we think about it, we think, oh, it's really negative. We need to get rid of all anxiety. And so you might say, is all anxiety bad? And the short answer is no, not all of it is bad. And to some degree, anxiety does actually have a biological and evolutionary purpose. And for those of you who have taken an introductory psychology course, or even it's in the public discourse, you've probably heard it about when we were cave people and we were wandering around doing cave people things. Suddenly, a tiger might rush out, or a lion, or whatever was hanging out those days, and people would have to mobilize. That seeing that tiger would provoke an instant fear response, an anxiety response, and their body would trigger all the reactions that they needed to run away from that tiger to live another day and go be cave people doing other things. And the people who perhaps didn't get too worried about that tiger, maybe they got eaten by it. And so there was a purpose biologically and evolutionary of this anxiety. And what has happened with modern society is we generally, for most of us, there's no actual physical tiger coming towards us, but we have all of these stressors that are just continuous stressors. So with the tiger, once it ran away, people's anxiety levels, it went up when they saw it, but then it came back down and it stayed there until the next threat came along. And we now live in a society where these threats are all the time. We've got this test looming over our heads. We have to worry about grades. We have to worry about jobs and school and all the things we have to worry about. And so that stress level just kind of goes up, 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 up. And then sometimes it doesn't come back down. So some level of that physiological arousal is useful, but at a certain point, it becomes too much. And if you're wondering if there's a line between too little and too much, there is. And it's a little bit abstract, but like with most things in science, somebody has made us a nice chart. And this is called the Yerkes-Dodson law. And what it tracks is basically how your level of arousal correlates with your level of performance. And we got our nice bell chart there. And what it shows us is over on the left-hand side is when your level of arousal is low. So when you're feeling bored or just laid back, you're scrolling on your phone on TikTok at night and you don't really care and you're not really paying attention. If you tried to take a test or to do something important while you're in that state, generally your performance will be pretty low. And if you've ever taken any kind of online test for work or for school and you're just kind of clicking through and not really paying attention, you're probably familiar with that state. As your arousal starts to go up, you start feeling more motivated, more productive, more determined. Sometimes people call this being in the flow state. That's when your performance is going to be the strongest because you've got enough arousal that you're like, yes, I'm ready to do it. I'm determined. And that's a good place to be. But if your anxiety keeps going up, your anxiety or your arousal is going up, 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 eventually your performance is going to start to come back down because now the way that you're feeling very overwhelmed, you're panicked, you're burned out. And this is a feeling probably most of us are pretty familiar with. And a lot of us honestly live in that state all the time. And it really is, it isn't good for our body, it isn't good for our mental health, and it's also not good for our performance. And everybody's level is different. And so you have to do a little bit of experimenting sometimes to figure out where the balance is in there because there's no official level of you need to be exactly this level of aroused or anxious or not anxious, but it's something you can play with and see. Sometimes people ask me why this matters because SAT and ACT they're not necessarily one-time events, but they're pretty time limited. But here's the thing about these tests and anxiety. School is never going to get easier from here. It's just going to get harder and harder and harder. And the skills that your child might learn to manage test anxiety right now for these big tests can be used for other tests, both in high school, when they get to college, and then also they may have to take, if they want to go to grad school, they've got another set of entrance exams. If they want to go into a professional occupation, doctor, lawyer, dentist, they've got professional exams they've got to take. And so it's a skill they can continue to use for school. But really, why it's important is because test anxiety skills are also life anxiety management skills. And the skills that you need to manage anxiety around these tests are the same that you need to manage anxiety about your job and about your bills and your family and work life and adult life. And learning them now, will make things a whole lot easier later on, because just like school never gets easier, life doesn't get easier either as you get older. And these are not skills that necessarily get taught at school or in places where your children might be. And so if no one's teaching them to your kids, there's a good chance they haven't learned them. And because we are in a college group, the other important reason it's important is because test scores still really do matter. And I'm not sure how much you've been following the news or following the Facebook group, but things have been really kind of confusing the last couple of years with test scores and test optional and test required. And recently, in the last few months, several high profile schools actually went back to requiring test scores. Dartmouth did, and Cornell just came out, I think, yesterday and said that they will, and several others. And so test scores still do matter for admissions, and they also matter for merit aid. A lot of schools that say they're test optional, if you actually dig into them, you'll find that people who are getting accepted both submit scores and they submit good scores, and the ones who are getting merit aid, which is aid that's based on your grades or your scores, those often go to people who have good test scores and have submitted them. So even though a lot of people have written off tests right now, you really shouldn't, because it closes your opportunities for admissions and for scholarships. So somebody asked about what to say and strategies and things, and there are a lot of ways to deal with this test anxiety. And there's different strategies to get at some of those different aspects that we talked about. On the educational side, one of the things that's really important is to make sure that your child has the basic skills they need. And like I was mentioning earlier, right now, a lot of students do not have the skills that they need. And sometimes this test is also the first piece of information that, hey, something's going that they don't actually know the things they need to know. And that is a signal that maybe they're going to struggle when they get to college. And um, what I have happened a lot of times is parents will come to me and say, well, my kid has a 4.8 and they're top 10% of their class, but they only scored a 50th percentile on the SAT or on the ACT. And then they tell me it's because they're a bad test taker or because they have test anxiety. And when I start working with them, I find out neither of those things are true. But what is actually happening is they can't do the work because they don't have the skills for it. And that is a wake up call for a lot of people. And I like to just view test scores as information. What that tells you is, hey, you need to do something about it, and you need to do something about it right now, because again, school doesn't get easier. So taking care of it at this moment will be easier while your child's still under your roof than for them to go off to college and then try to figure it out on their own, necessarily without the resources that they might have while they're still at home. And so if you do find out your child might have some of these skill gaps, it's important that you remediate them in some way. And there's different ways to do that. Some kids can self-study. That's hard, though. A lot of kids won't do it. And a tutor can help taking group classes. And I'm not even talking about test prep. I'm just talking about make sure they've got their basic math skills. And if they don't, maybe send them to a group class at somewhere like Kumon or some of the
Kelly,
other
maybe you can talk a little bit about
places.
what you have been seeing,
Mhm.
how prepared students used to be maybe
Yeah.
before the pandemic versus now.
Yes. So On both the SAT and the ACT, here's an example. There's a lot of grammar on both tests, and a lot of the questions test both on both tests they test punctuation. They also test things like subject-verb agreement, tense agreement, making sure that your verbs and your nouns match with each other. And what I have found in the last couple of years is that I would say probably 75% of my students cannot reliably identify parts of speech in their grammar skills. And so sometimes there will be a question that's testing verb agreement or tense agreement. So seeing should you use present tense or past tense. And I'll ask the students to look at the answer choices and I'll say, what are they testing you on? And what I'm looking for is for them to identify that those are verbs in the thing. And when they have verbs there, they're looking either for a tense issue or for a subject verb agreement. And they'll look at those words and not be able to tell me. And so I'll say, what part of speech are those words? And often they don't know what part of speech means. So I'll further clarify. I'll say, are those nouns? Or are they verbs? Are they adjectives? And they can't tell me that either. So I'll say, what's a noun? And they can't tell me that either. And that is not something that I used to see at all. And that is a very fundamental level of basic English grammar. And separate from the pandemic, I have also heard that many schools have just stopped teaching grammar at all. And so some students missed it because of pandemic. Some people have missed it just because it isn't being taught. But you can't do grammar questions and you can't write well if you don't know what a noun is, if you don't know what a verb is. And it's similarly in math. I'm finding that students don't have the basic algebra 1 skills that they need. So they can't solve for X, they can't graph a line, they can't reliably pick out points on a graph. And these are skills that are typically taught in 7th or 8th grade. And by the time they're in 11th grade, they should have those skills very well down, and they don't. So those gaps are definitely there, and they're pretty consistent. And I work with students all across the country, and I'm seeing the same thing from kids all over. It's also important that you make sure your child has enough time to prepare for these tests and the resources to do it. And the time is probably going to be more time than you think. Sometimes people think you can just spend a couple of weeks, read a book, go take the test and be fine. And for most students, typically everybody's different, but generally 2 to 3 months is really the minimum that I recommend. And a lot of students need closer to maybe 4 to 6 months. Some people spend a year preparing. That's not generally what I recommend, but I would count on at least a few months up to around 6 months. And it's important that they have the resources that they need to. And there are all kinds of different resources they can use for test prep. The thing I always recommend is that they use official materials when they can. And official materials are materials that come from the test maker. So right now, for SAT, the College Board has an app called the Blue Book app. At the moment, it's fairly limited because a new SAT did just come out, and so there are limited resources for it. Hopefully, some of those will be added over time. And then for ACT, they have an official book that you can use. It's a big red book called the Official ACT Guide. And the reason it's so important to use those materials when you can is because since they're from the test makers, we know that the material is generally correct. And so you want to make sure you're using those. And then sometimes, especially for the new SAT, because it is so new and there is not much material for it, you may have to supplement with some other materials for those. It's also important to really know your child and what they will do and what they won't do, because I have a lot of parents who will hand a book to their kid, and the books are giant. The old SAT book was 1,300 pages, ACT book's about 1,100 pages. And for most kids, if you hand them that big giant book and say, here, go study this, there are some kids who will open it and do a little bit, but what will happen with most kids is it will go under their bed or in their closet and it will never come out again. And if you know that about your child, that they are the type of person who are not going to study on their own, it probably would be helpful to get them some outside help to do it. And outside help can look like an individual tutor, could be online or in person. There are also group classes, again, on person or in person or online, that you can do. but you need to make sure that they're set up for success in that way. And one of the things that's really challenging for kids who do try to self-study is that they often just don't know what to study and how to study it. And that's really important because when you do have an 1100 page book, most kids do not need to know all of the information in it. They don't have to know how to do all of the problems. The kids who are trying to get a very top score, very close to perfect, they got to know just about everything. But for everybody else who's kind of a middle level test score or maybe like 75th, 85th percentile, you actually don't have to know how to do everything. You just need to know enough to score in the range that you need to score. And that's not something kids will naturally know. And there's no reason for them to know that. But it is something that people who work in test prep can help your child with, is knowing where to spend that time and energy, because you can waste an awful lot of time working on things that are not going to pay off. It's also important, once you make sure you've set your child up with the time and the resources, that they actually are preparing. And the reason I say that is because there are so many competing priorities for students. And, with your kid, they've got sports, they've got extracurriculars, they've got their friends, they've got their applications, they might have college visits depending on where they're at. And there's always going to be some other thing that feels more compelling than studying for these tests. So let's make sure they are doing it. And then the last thing I want to say about that is if you do think there might be some kind of learning difference or attention issue going on, I highly recommend that you get your child evaluated if you can. And there are several reasons for that, but what I see is so important about that is, like we said earlier, school doesn't get easier and it's just going to get harder. And if there is something going on, I always feel like it's better to know than to not know. And if there is something in the background, not naming it is not going to make it go away. And why I say that is because sometimes parents tell me, well, I don't want to get my kid diagnosed. I don't want to have them tested because I don't want them to have this stigma, or I don't want them to rely on accommodations. I don't want to, all kinds of reasons. And all of those are valid reasons. And I'm not dismissing those, because those are things to be concerned about. But if it's there, whether you name it or not. And it is easier to deal with things now than to deal with them later. And if you're concerned that something might be going on, the way generally what you need to do about that is you can talk to the school. Your child would need to get an evaluation, which some schools can do it through the schools. Sometimes they'll have you go to an outside source. And if you go to an outside source, it's usually a psychologist who runs those tests. And they're generally called either neuropsych eval or sometimes psychoeducational evaluations. And one of the downsides of it, they do tend to be expensive, but there are ways to get them done. And if that is a concern for you, you might want to talk to your child's guidance counselor, or potentially to your pediatrician if you have one who you trust. They might be able to give you information about that. And the other thing that's important about that too is if your child does have a learning difference, they may qualify for accommodations on the test. And most accommodations, there are all kinds of them, but most of them are time accommodations, which means you get extra time to take the test. And for many students, that can actually make a significant difference. And sometimes that is a source of stress and anxiety too, that they cannot work quickly enough to perform well on the test. Sometimes parents are a little concerned about that, and they'll say, well, I don't want them to get time accommodations because it's a crutch, or they're relying on something, or it's an unfair advantage. And what I have to say to that is if your child qualifies for extended time or any other kind of accommodation, it's fair to use it. It is not cheating. It is just providing them with access that is similar to what other people have in a way that suits them. So don't be afraid of it if you think there might be something going on
So,
like that.
Kelly,
Mhm.
there was somebody who asked about
Mhm.
extended time accommodations earlier. And
Yeah.
can you maybe just talk a little bit more about, if you know, are there certain requirements that need to be in place for somebody to make it, it's not just, at this point, like a parent or a student saying, oh, I'd like more time.
Right. Yeah, because everybody
But
would do that, certainly.
right. So what kind of needs to
Mhm.
be in
Yeah.
place before they can go ask for more time?
So that evaluation is one of the really, really important pieces. Generally, both SAT and ACT want to see a neuropsych eval or psychoeducational evaluation within about the last 3 years. And often they want to see too that you have accommodations in place in school.
Mm-hmm.
And the rules shift over time. And they if you need documentation though for sure. And a big piece is that evaluation. And then they also sometimes need some documentation from your school as well. And I know with the ACT, the request for accommodation, I believe, has to be submitted through the school. So you'll need to talk to your school counselor about how to do that. And the ACT used to be more difficult with granting time extensions, but now they have changed the rules a little bit so that if your child has a 504 or an IEP plan already set up at school, it's much more automatic. You still have to apply for it, but they won't fight you on it as much. And then the SAT has a little bit different procedure to do. And I am not totally familiar with that one, but you can contact the College Board to ask them about how to
And
get that one
do
done.
you generally have a sense of like how long in advance somebody should start this process? Because it doesn't like happen within two
It
weeks.
doesn't happen,
It can
right.
take a few months.
It can. So I would say as soon as you know which test your child might be taking, and if you don't know which test your child is going to take, just apply for both of them so that you have it on file because it can take a while. ACT has gotten better about it being much quicker, but I've had students that it's taken months for them to
Mm-hmm.
decide. What can also happen is sometimes they may deny the request. And if they deny the request, you do have the option to appeal it. And I always recommend that people appeal because often the reason is something like you didn't have a piece of paper that you needed, or
Mm-hmm.
the school forgot to submit something, or there was not a signature on it. So if they deny it, appeal it. And a lot of the students that I've had who have appealed, they have gotten it overturned and they got their extended time, but they also qualified for it as well. So you want to leave time for that as well because that extends your time. So I'd say as soon as you know your kid's going to take tests, get on the process because also if your school's involved, you need to allow the school time to do it too. And if you're at a big public school with thousands of kids, those counselors are overworked and there's a possibility something might slip through the cracks or it
Mm-hmm.
just takes them a while. So yeah, that's a great point. Start early for those.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So then there's also the cognitive piece that we talked about, which are the thoughts. And there's a couple of different ways you can work on the cognitive piece of test anxiety. And one of them is really to learn to identify and stop the cognitive distortions. And cognitive distortions, there's a whole category of them. There's a lot of different types, but one of the common ones is the catastrophizing that we spoke about earlier, like thinking, okay, if I don't pass this test, eventually I'm going to end up on the street alone and starving and dying. That's catastrophizing. Or very black and white thinking is another one, which where it's very all or nothing. It's either I get a really good score on this test and I'm a good person and I'm a good student, or I score badly on this test and it means everything is awful and I can't do it. And there are a lot of other ones, but those are kind of the main ones I see with my students. And just helping students be able to identify that they're even having those thoughts because if you've just been having those thoughts constantly, a lot of times you can't even recognize them. They just feel normal and like, but yeah, everybody thinks like that. And to some degree, we all have thoughts like that. And it might be about anxiety, tests or your work or your children, all kinds of stuff. But once you know what they are, you can start to see them and then you can start to change them because if you don't know them, you can't do anything to change them. And the same is true with the negative self-talk. And so a lot of times I hear from kids, I'm bad at this, I'm worthless, I can't do it. And just it goes on and on and on and on. And again, we all do that to some degree. And it's a learned habit. We weren't born thinking those terrible thoughts about ourselves. And there are some different ways to stop and interrupt those thoughts. And I always feel a little silly when I describe them because they sound dumb, but they're actually pretty effective techniques. They're ones I have used myself. They're part of the literature about anxiety and how to manage them. And they're called thought stopping techniques. And what my favorite one is literally when you start hearing those crazy thoughts going on and on of I can't do it, it's bad, I'm going to fail, is to imagine a big giant stop sign right in front of your face. Like see it in front of you and literally either say out loud or in your head very emphatically stop. just stop. And sounds dumb, but it is actually effective in interrupting that pattern, because once you start spiraling, it's really hard to control those thoughts. And if you can be like, stop, I'm not. And once you stop that thought, you recognize it, you stop it, then you can redirect it. And that's where you get into the affirmations and the positive self-talk. And I think that's what somebody had asked about earlier. And you really want to focus on positive things. And if you're of a certain age, you probably saw on Saturday Night Live, remember Stuart Smalley said, and that one was silly, but he said, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me. You don't have to say that, but it's along those lines. And again, it sounds kind of silly, and you might think that's not going to help, it's not going to work. But what you really want to think about is the positives of things. So for affirmations, that's your very positive self-talk of, I can do this, I'm capable, I can learn this stuff, I am worthy, I'm a good student, I will succeed, I will go to college. And it's really important to frame them in the positive version rather than in the negative version. So sometimes people will say as their affirmation, I'm not going to fail, I'm not going to do badly. And even though it sounds like a positive, you've actually still got those words bad and fail in there, and your brain is still hearing them. So instead of saying, I'm not going to fail, you can say, I'm going to succeed, I'm going to do well, I will get into a college that is a good place for me, there is a place for me. And developing that habit. And you can put, you see people put them on their mirror, put them on their wall or in their notebook, and it seems hokey, but seeing that does help affirm to your brain that, oh yeah, things are actually manageable and I can do them. And it is a really important thing to learn, and for all of us. And even as adults, a lot of us, if you stop to think about yourself, think about what you were thinking about last hour or 2 hours ago, you probably had a lot of thoughts like these about whatever your grown-up concerns are, because that it is easier to think negative thoughts sometimes than it is to think positively. But it is important to do it. And it's important too, when you're talking to your children, that you really help them understand that these tests are not a measure of self-worth. And that is super important, because I do have a lot of kids caught up in thinking, well, if I don't do well on this test, it means I'm a bad person. It means I'm not successful. I've disappointed my parents. And none of that's true. All tests are, it's information about how you did on this test on a particular day. And that's it. And it really is, it says nothing about you as a person or your self-worth. And I think it's really important for kids to hear that, because it is easy to get caught up in thinking, this does say if I'm a good person or not. And it doesn't.
Kelly, can you maybe emphasize again what we talked earlier, how you said you really find very few students who are bad test takers. It's really more that they just might not have the skills.
Yeah, so it is so common for me, especially now. Parents come to me all the time, and their kids too, and they say, I'm a bad test taker, I can't do it. And when we are working, I find out they're not bad test takers. They just don't have those skills like we talked about earlier. And that actually sounds like bad news, but we can put a spin on it, make it positive. What it actually is, it is also just information that says, hey, you're just missing some skills. And you know what? Missing skills is fixable. Whereas being a bad test taker, and there are people legitimately who will never be good at taking tests. That is also true. But the majority of people, what they think is being a bad test taker is just they don't have the skills they need. And when you remediate them, you find out, oh, actually, they're quite capable of taking these
And
tests
when
and
you
doing
say
well in them.
skills, it could
Mhm.
be potentially like how to take the test, but it's also they may
Mhm.
just not have enough of the right knowledge at that point.
Correct. Yeah. And
Yes.
that, yes, that's exactly what I mean, is they don't have the fundamentals of algebra that they need in order to answer algebra 2 questions. They don't have that grammar knowledge that we spoke about. And that stuff, you can fix that. And again, there are always caveats. Some people have learning differences, some people have other things going on, but the majority of people, it's generally an issue of they have some things they need to fix, that's all. And knowing that can actually just be a huge relief, because people do build up these big stories of, I'm a bad test taker and that's the end of the story. It's not true.
So one other quick question.
Mhm.
If what's your experience of both how long a student should prep for and how much what type of score increase could they potentially get if they've done like the
They've done
proper
the things.
preparation? Yeah.
Yeah, so again, I'd recommend 2 to 3 months kind of as a minimum. For some students, 4 to 6 months is probably a better level. And it's always really difficult to answer the question about score increases because it really depends on a whole lot of factors, especially things like where students are starting out and what their real abilities are, because there are real ceilings to where people can reach on their scores. Most people can improve, but there is a point where they will reach their actual ability and their actual a pretty good representation of their score. And so students who start kind of in the lower scores, so like for SAT, which is out of 1600, if you're starting right in the middle, which is 1000, 100 points is a strong increase. Some students will be able to increase several hundred points. Some will increase less. For ACT, 2 to 3 points is a pretty significant jump. And that changes as you get higher and higher. So if you're starting out at a 1400 to a 1500 is a much harder jump than 1000 to 1100, because then you're getting into the nitty gritty of the really hard questions. And so people ask me that a lot, and I never have a super compelling answer because the answer is it depends. But if you look at a lot of the big test prep companies, and they've changed some, but in the past they used to say, 100 points SAT was a decent increase. 2 to 3 points on ACT was a pretty significant increase as well.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Um, and then the last thing you want to pay attention to with anxiety is your physical body as well, because that is a major manifestation of anxiety, and also to manage it. And these are things that we all know that we all should be doing it anyway for health. It's important that you talk with your child about them and that also you model them. So things like making sure you're getting enough exercise, that you're getting enough sleep, that they're getting enough sleep, eating well, drinking, getting enough water, and just generally taking care of themselves. And something easy to do, go for a walk with your kid. It's good for your interpersonal relationship. It's good for your physical health. It's good for your anxiety. It's good for their anxiety. And and make sure you provide them with the things they need to live a healthy life. And then there are also some other physical type techniques you can use. One of them is called progressive muscle relaxation. And there are all kinds of different ways to do this. There's ones that you can find on YouTube. You can find them on an app called Insight Timer, which has a lot of meditation type things. And progressive muscle relaxation is really just where you sit and relax, and then you very systematically tense and release each of your different muscle groups. So what you might do is relax in your chair, close your eyes, or just lower your eyes a bit, take a deep breath, you breathe out, and then you tense up just your toes, and you tense them very tight, 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 and then you release them. You take a breath in, and you take a breath out, and then you just move progressively, as it implies, up your body. So then the next muscles that you might tense are maybe your calves. So you tense them, your feet, and then you release them. And you go up your body till you get to the top. You tighten everything and release it. And that, for a lot of people, is a very calming technique. Some people don't like that one as much. I don't particularly care for that one because once I tighten my muscles and they tend to get stuck there. If you don't like that version, another version that you could use is to imagine something like light traveling up your body and progressively relaxing your body as it goes. Um, and that's a nice one to practice maybe at night before bed, or in the morning, or sometime where you're feeling stressed. And it's nice to lie down to do it, but you also can do it sitting in a chair, and you can do it pretty quickly. And then there are also deep breathing techniques. There's a lot of different ones. The one that I like is called the box method. And there are different ways to do this, but basically what it involves is doing very systematically, taking a deep breath in for a certain amount of counts, holding it for a certain amount, and then releasing it. And the counts that I like to use 4, 4, and 4. And so we can try it out really quick if you like. So if you're sitting in your chair, let's kind of relax. And we're going to take a deep breath in for 4 counts, hold it for 4, and then release. So if you're ready, take a deep breath in and hold it, or take a deep breath in for 4. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. And hold it. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can play around with it. Different people like to do different things. Some people like to do a 4-8-4 pattern. Some people like to hold their breath longer. Some people like to make them equal. You can play around and see what you like. And deep breathing is also one of those things. Some people like it, some people hate it. I find just taking deep breaths makes me really anxious, but I like that box one because it feels controlled. And whenever you're practicing any of these techniques, if you ever feel like you're hyperventilating, like if your fingers ever start going numb or your face starts going numb or it just makes you feel really anxious, back off of it because it shouldn't make you more anxious. It should calm you down. But you can try out those things. And there's all kinds of information on the internet too about those. And in terms of our takeaways for today, so things to remember, some level of anxiety is normal, but too much is harmful. And really the most important thing I want you to come away from this is knowing that test anxiety really can't be managed. And this stuff, it's understandable, it's controllable, you can manage it. It does not have to run your life or control it. And it's really important to address all of the aspects of it and make sure you're dealing with the physical part, the emotional part, the cognitive part. And if you're a parent, just ask your kid questions. Ask them how they're doing, if they're feeling anxious about this, because sometimes they don't even know they're feeling anxious about it, but they don't really understand necessarily what's happening or they haven't thought about it in that way. And make sure you focus on a growth mindset. And a growth mindset is really just the idea that you can improve, you can get better, that you're capable of doing things, and that you're not limited by having this test anxiety. And then if it is really interfering with your child's life, if they aren't sleeping or eating, or they're having profound emotional distress, that is an indication that they may need some outside help. They might need to see a therapist or a counselor for that.
So Kelly,
So,
what about with
yes.
the new, digital
Mhm.
adaptive test? Do you think that students could potentially be more anxious about that? A, because it's harder to, there's, again, as we, like at the beginning of the conversation, there's fewer actual tests out there to practice on. And then just by the pure nature of the test, like I mean, I'm just going back to my days, where I could get stuck on a problem and say, okay, I'm going to skip ahead and then come back. And you
Yeah.
can't do that anymore.
So you can actually do that, but what you're asking about, for those of you who don't know about the new SAT, it is digital and it's what's called section adaptive. And so for the reading and writing section and for the math sections, you'll have 2 reading and writing, you'll have 2 math. And for the first section of each of those, you'll have a mixture of easy, medium, and hard questions. And then depending on how you do on that module, you'll either get shuttled into the easier second module or you'll get shuttled into the harder one. And that's the adaptive nature of it. And so people are taking different things. And March was the first time this test was administered, and there was a lot of anxiety that I heard about after this test was taken because people were caught off guard by the fact, especially the kids who got the harder second module, the problems got really, really hard and they weren't expecting that. And they did have a lot of anxiety about it. And it threw a lot of people off because they're like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this. And so part of managing that is just understanding that that's to be expected. And if you do get the harder module, there is a good chance there's going to be stuff on there you don't know, and that's fine. And so just managing the expectation can help with that of, yep, some of that stuff's going to be really hard, and that's not a problem. And you do, they have not been very transparent about how the scoring works, but generally on an adaptive test, the harder questions are worth more. So you do want to make sure you can get to the harder level if you can, because sometimes people are like, oh, well, I want to get the easier one so I can get all the easy questions right. But you don't. You want to try to get to that harder one, and you do have to sit with the knowledge that, yep, there's going to be some things on here that are a little bit insane, and that's okay. Just do your best on the ones you can do. And within the section, you can go backwards and forth through problems, so you can skip a problem and come back to it. And that's part of managing that anxiety too, is knowing which questions are worth it to answer and which are not. And that goes back to what I mentioned earlier about a lot of times students just don't know how to prepare because they've never seen it before. They don't know. There's no reason for them to know.
So somebody's asking, should the first thing a student do is take a practice test? Like, would that help maybe take some of the anxiety away of just,
Yes.
knowing what the test format's going to be like?
hmm Yeah, absolutely. And that's the first thing that I always recommend is to take a practice test and see how it goes. And for two reasons. One, it does help with that anxiety, but it's also really important information for the student. And also, if they're working with anybody, to give them information about where the student is starting from, what the likely trajectory of their study needs to be, and where they're likely to be able to end up. And so, yes, absolutely do that. And that actually reminds me, that's one of the things about test prep that also can help with anxiety is just familiarity with what you're doing and what you're going to see. Because when you have spent months going over this material, test prep is all about pattern recognition. They put the same kinds of things on there all the time, and you'll start to recognize, oh, when they have a comma like this, it's a tip off that it's this kind of question. When they have these two verbs, it's a subject verb agreement question, or in this math. And so when you start to learn those patterns, that can also reduce your anxiety as well because you've seen it and you sit down and you're like, oh yeah, I know this stuff, I've seen it.
So we weren't actually planning on sharing this, but maybe we can talk a little bit about it, and we'll send more information in a link about that we do have access to a free practice digital SAT. And maybe Kelly, if you could talk a little bit about what your suggestion is about when to take that test relative to the other free
Mhm.
digital practice tests that are available, and maybe how to use the free one that we have versus the ones that the College Board is
Mhm.
also offering.
Yeah, so with the SAT, since it is new, the College Board, who's the parent company for SAT, they have released 6 digital tests that are on the Blue Book app that we mentioned earlier. And normally, I always recommend use official material first, but because there is such a limited amount of material right now, you do have to supplement a little bit with other materials. And I know that the test that you're offering through your site is a very good test. It's very well researched and is a good one to use as a baseline. And so I would highly recommend using that one as a first test so that you still have this pool of other tests since they're fairly limited. And I would recommend generally, most students take the test around their junior year. So some people take summer before junior year, some take more towards the fall and then towards the end. I would not recommend waiting until the summer after your junior year for most students because it's a little bit too late. But I'd say sometime by the end of sophomore year or early-ish or middle of the summer before junior year, definitely take a practice test and see because that will give you some information. Like if your child's scoring much lower than you thought they were going to be scoring, all that says is they're going to need some more time to prepare for it. And it's better to have more time than to have less time for it. So I'd say by the beginning of junior year, make sure they've at least taken something, a practice test. They don't have to have taken an official test by then.
And any information to share about, I mean, we've been focusing, or just in this past few minutes of the conversation about the SAT because it went digital, but there
Mhm.
are kind of rumors that the ACT is working on going digital too, right?
Yes, and that's a little bit murkier. I don't have anything official to report on that, but I do know ACT has been giving some digital versions of the paper and pencil version test. And so, and that especially seems to be for school districts who give tests to all of their students or to all of their juniors. And my understanding of that one is it's just a computerized version of their paper and pencil test. And if your child has an option to either take a digital version ACT or a paper version, I would highly recommend that they take the paper version because that test is not optimized to be taken on a computer and it is much harder to do it. And there are things on the ACT that are much easier to do with paper and pencil. So if you have a choice, go with paper and pencil. And as for their future plans, it's unclear. They're making noise about going to a digital test, but nothing's official yet.
So this is April. I'm just kind of curious if I was a parent that had a 10th grader or an
Mhm.
11th grader, do you think, like, how would you suggest that they prepare, and which tests should they aim for?
So in terms of which test to take, it actually doesn't matter at this point because all schools that still accept test scores will take either the SAT or the ACT. And so what I generally recommend is if your child has a PSAT score from the fall of sophomore year and you feel like that's a reasonable representation of their abilities, what I always recommend is to take a practice ACT test, and you can find those online to take, and it's something they can print out and take at home and compare the scores for them. And they are on different scales, so you can't directly compare them. But typically, how I look at them is I look up the percentile ranks for them, and you can put in percentile rank SAT and their score, and it will say this is in the 60th percentile or this is 75th. And you can do the same thing for ACT. That way you can reasonably compare the scores. So a 70th percentile SAT is reasonably equivalent-ish to a 70th percentile ACT. And if there's a test that if one of them is clearly better than the other, I usually recommend pursuing that test. If they're pretty equal, then it's a little bit less clear what to do. But in that situation, what I usually do is ask the student what they thought about them, because sometimes students are very clear that sometimes they'll tell me, I hated that test and I'm never taking it again. And when that is the case, don't go with that one, go with the other one. And then the other things to consider too are things like just the logistics of it. When are the tests offered? What does your child's school schedule look like? What does their extracurricular and their sports activities look like? And all things being equal, you just ask them which one they want to take if there's really no deciding factor. I will say though, right now, because the digital SAT is so new, it is more difficult to prepare for it right now because of the lack of materials and also the lack of transparency about the scoring. And they are not going to be releasing past tests, past copies of past tests, which they have done in the past and they do for ACT. And that does make it significantly more difficult to prepare for than the ACT, which has 15 years worth of materials that one can access and use.
And somebody's asking a question, which you mentioned, but let's just repeat it. They're saying, do certain colleges favor one test over the other?
No, it used to be that way in the past, but now all schools that accept scores will take either.
Great. Okay, any more questions? We'll give people like a few minutes or a few seconds to maybe add something in, but this is very helpful. Kelly, I feel like I'm going to spend a little time tonight practicing my breathing.
And the nice thing is this stuff is helpful for everybody. I
Right,
mean,
right.
most of us are anxious and I use a lot of these techniques too. And I was actually telling Debbie earlier, I was a little nervous before we started and I tried out my breathing and I did the things like this stuff, it's stuff I use too. And so I know some of it seems silly, but try it out. And there are lots of other ways too. You can find stuff on the internet and not all things work for all people, but it's worth trying it out.
So there's a question, is it possible colleges could lower SAT score expectations because of the new digital SAT? Like, you know,
And
because,
that
yeah,
question, I don't deal with the admissions side of things, so I'm not sure I can totally speak knowledgeably to that. But what I can say is that the College Board has said that the scores, at least they're saying it right now, scores from the digital test are supposed to be comparable to scores from the paper and pencil test. And I don't know if that will end up being true or not, but that is what they're saying at the moment. So my guess would be no, but also possible. I don't know. It's
yeah,
not
it's a
totally my
little hard
area.
to tell. I mean, because we haven't yet gone through an admission cycle with
Right.
the scores from the digital SAT.
Hmm. Yeah. But it is a little bit like the Wild West out there right now with all of it.
It is, unfortunately. Okay, well, thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you, everybody who watched tonight, and you'll get a recording tomorrow. And you'll also get some more information about how to reach out to Kelly. If you'd like her, if you'd like to talk to her about test prep or, you know, potentially have her work with your students, she's got different programs and packages that we'll share more information about.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Oh, somebody had a namaste hands.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everyone. And
Thanks so much.
see you soon. Bye.